Grace and peace from God who is, who was, and who is to come. Amen. I need to let you all know before I begin, my opening example here is not really either G or PG even, so if you need to cover some young ears or distract them for a couple of minutes, I will not be offended. Because earlier this week I came across an eyewitness account of how an occupying army paid retribution upon its uncooperative citizens. And it's not really for the faint of heart. While the holy place blazed, the victors plundered everything that fell in their way. They slaughtered wholesale all who were caught. No pity was shown for age, no reverence for rank. Children and elderly, lay and priests alike were massacred. Every class was pursued and encompassed in the grasp of war, whether they were begging for mercy or offering resistance. And the din, nothing more deafening or appalling could be conceived than the noise. There were war cries of the armies sweeping onward in mass, the howls of the people who, cut off, fled panic-stricken, only to fall into the arms of the foe, and their shrieks as they met their fate. But yet more awful than the uproar were the suffering. You would indeed have thought that the Temple Hill was boiling over from its base, being everywhere one mass of flame, but yet that the stream of blood was more copious than the flames, and the slain more numerous than the slayers. For the ground was nowhere visible through the corpses, but the soldiers had to clamber over the heaps of bodies in pursuit of the fugitives. Here in the United States, we've had awful things happen in these past several months as well. We've had senseless killings out in Nevada, and then a former military reject attacked a congregation in Texas. We've endured hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, which devastated vast tracts of Florida and Texas and nearly wiped out all of Puerto Rico. Some of those places were still rebuilding from Katrina when this trio of hazard came along. This week we've heard all kinds of allegations, accusations, charges of sexually inappropriate behavior brought against people from all walks of life. People in position of power, politicians and entertainers, news people. All who used that position of influence to bend subordinates to their own sexual desires. Earlier this year, we had raging fires out in the western states, and a years-long drought that, when it finally broke, the nearly overwhelming rains caused flooding and landslides. Now, maybe here in central Pennsylvania, we feel a little bit inoculated from all of that. We really haven't had droughts that turned into raging fires. We really didn't feel the wrath of those hurricanes. Yeah, we got some strong winds and some rain, but nothing like what they endured in the southeast. In the mid-state, we might feel a little dulled by all of the sex scandal reports and trials. We've had to endure so many of those of our own. Those allegations don't really seem to shock us that much. And we had to learn how to live with our own mass shooting from West Nickel Mines a few years ago. And so while we mourned with the rest of the nation over the reasonless loss of life, those reports might open up some of our own wounds, bring up our own memories which make us turn inward, so that we might be tuning out the trauma of the greater part of the nation. But regardless, if we tune things out or if we're keeping up with everything, all of this pain and suffering and hurt goes on. And we care, or maybe we don't care, or maybe we're somewhere in the middle. I don't know where you might be. I kind of wonder, though, if that's not how the people in our gospel lesson might have been feeling. Because you see, our text this morning, it's what we call an apocalyptic text. You might be familiar with the word apocalypse. It's been used in lots of movies. You might know of it in terms of end times or total destruction. But in actuality, the word apocalypse means literally revelation. Something is being revealed to you. That's why the last book in our New Testament in Greek is literally titled The Apocalypse of John, or as you might be more familiar with it, the Revelation of John, or as it's generally translated, simply the book of Revelation. I think that's what's happening in our reading from Mark this morning. Jesus was in the temple. He was teaching his followers and anybody else who happened to be there. Anyone who wanted to join in the conversation. We learned about that earlier in the chapter. We didn't hear it in our reading this morning, but some representatives from some of the other religious factions of the day had come along and they had asked Jesus a bunch of questions trying to trip him up. But in our reading this morning, what we heard, Jesus goes off on a little bit of a tangent. He wants folks to understand a couple of things. First, he wants people to know that following him is going to alienate them from others. Possibly even alienate them to the point of bloodshed. He also wants them to know that he will return. And so he tells them what to be on the lookout for. And what he tells them really isn't pretty. In those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Yet in the midst of that darkness, Jesus also gives the people a word of promise. From the fig tree, learn this lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and put forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Hope in the darkness. That's what Jesus gives to his hearers. He gave it to them 2,000-ish years ago, and he gives it to us today as well. The people in Jesus' day needed to hear this word of hope because they were waiting for their Messiah to lead them against their enemies, to rise up against the Roman occupiers, to lead them into freedom. That's what they thought the Messiah was going to do. And the first hearers of Mark's gospel needed to hear this promise of hope as well. Because that opening example that I read, all of that blood and death and destruction, that was actually about the Jewish revolt from 66 to 72 in the first century, when the Roman legions laid siege, which led to the destruction of the temple and the razing of Jerusalem. That description that I read came from a book called The Jewish War. It was written by a Jewish rebel turned Roman by the name of Josephus. The residents of Jerusalem in Mark's day needed a sign of hope. The first century believers were expecting Jesus to return soon. And when he wasn't there, Mark, through the words of Jesus, gave the people the hope that they needed. A reminder of the promise that Jesus made. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Jesus will return. He will come again. We just called him Emmanuel, and that means God with us. And we call him that for a reason, because God is with us in everything that happens to us, in all of the good and gracious and wonderful things that we experience, as well as those awful, horrible, destructive times that we go through. God is with us. And Jesus will return. He will bring a light that never goes out. He will stop all of that destruction and chaos and killing and bring with him a new world where there is no hurt and pain and death. And so we prepare. We get ready. And we wait, knowing that Jesus will come again because he promised. And Christ always keeps his word. Amen.